Hello, everyone. Good morning. Well, morning for me. It's just after 8 o'clock here where I am in Canada. I'm a morning person, so that's okay. I want to thank my dear friend and colleague Yael, as well as all of the members of the Linguistic Justice Society. It's such an honor to be here, and I hope I can do your organization justice with my presentation today. I'm going to be presenting in ASL, and then we have an interpreter, Audra, who you will hear interpreting the presentation into English. And so my presentation today is called Deaf Interpreters and Epistemic Injustice. I would like to give you a sense of where I am going in this presentation. I'm going to take you on a bit of a journey. So to start, I am going to provide some background, the policy context in which this research takes place. I will then talk about intralingual interpreting, which means interpreting within the same language, and epistemic injustice. And then I will share the details of two studies that I'm undertaking. So to start, I would like to define a deaf interpreter, or DI. So a DI is a sign language interpreter who is themselves deaf. They can work in a professional or amateur context, which I think is important to recognize that their work is sometimes done in a professional, recognized, paid capacity, but sometimes it is not recognized, and I think it's important that to honor that they're still doing this work in many different contexts. And DIs will work often as part of a team with a hearing interpreter, though not always, but typically you'll see a hearing interpreter interpreting from a spoken language into a signed language, and the deaf interpreter is working from that signed language into the same named language, but using additional linguistic resources to make the interpretation more clear to the target audience. Here in Canada, and really in many countries around the world, there does not exist any formal certification or training for DIs, and this is true of many countries. There are some places that do have more formal certification and training. The US does have more training, although typically it's not under formal college or university programs. It's typically offered through private organizations. When we look at the field of sign language interpreters, there are many, many hearing interpreters and very few DIs, or deaf interpreters. In this picture here, this is someone you might recognize. His name is Nigel Howard, and he's a DI here in Canada, very well known. During the early days of COVID, you might recall the government emergency briefings that were taking place on the news every day, and in BC, there was the Premier Bonnie Henry, who was always there on the news providing information about social distancing and masking, and Nigel was always there to interpret that into sign language. I want to provide some policy background now, just to set the stage for this research. Now, in Canada, when we look at interpreting, both hearing interpreters and deaf interpreters, in 2019, we had the Accessible Canada Act passed, which was the first federal level disability legislation across Canada. And that legislation included a section that recognized sign languages as the primary languages for communication by deaf persons in Canada. This existed in some provinces at provincial levels, but not at a federal level. And so American Sign Language, Quebec Sign Language, and Indigenous sign languages, of which there are multiple, became recognized as languages in Canada. Now, we might ask, why is it important that these languages were recognized as part of legislation around accessibility? And really, the motivation for getting this passed was because of deaf community advocacy. We can also look to Canada's previous ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities as one of the key motivators for passing the Accessible Canada Act. And this also encouraged Canada to formally recognize sign languages. So I hope this gives you a bit of a sense of the policy background in Canada. And I would like now to zoom out for a moment, and I want us to think about sign language rights. Now, when we think about linguistic justice, and for the members of the Linguistic Justice Society, we can discuss language ideologies and look at where language rights come from. And language rights typically comes from a negative rights framework, in which this is a hands-off approach where the government does not interfere with a language group's use of their own language. It's a tolerance-oriented approach where the government says you have every right to use your language, we will not interfere. And for some communities, this may be perfectly fine and their language may continue to flourish within their own community. The other way that we can look at language rights is from a positive rights approach, where the government is investing in public services. And Van Parijs, who is really the father of linguistic justice, felt that linguistic justice would be, for example, looking at political management of different languages within a given territory. And so for some societies, this negative rights approach would be enough. But one issue with this framing is that when we look at sign language specifically, the government tends to think of positive rights as hiring interpreters, and that's really the extent of it. But many deaf scholars have argued that this is not enough to provide true linguistic justice, and that there needs to be other types of access beyond just hiring an interpreter. And the reason for this is that most deaf children are born into hearing families with parents who do not know sign language. And so these children are not growing up in an environment with an accessible language around them, with a flourishing language that they can access, and so that needs to be provided to them somehow. So that was really the background for this research, and what my research looked at was intralingual interpreting by DIs. And so intralingual interpreting means within the same language. DIs will also do interlingual interpreting, which means in between two different languages. So for example, here in Canada, DIs typically will work between ASL and LSQ, Quebec Sign Language. But I am specifically looking at intralingual interpreting with this research, and that is the majority of work that DIs tend to do. And so in this situation, we would have a hearing interpreter working from a spoken language into a signed language. And the DI is there to interpret in a way that better matches the target audience. And often the target audience might be recognized as deaf individuals who have quote unquote no language, or who may be less fluent in a named sign language, or who may be fully monolingual and not have access to the dominant spoken language. And so this is often the audience that DIs are working with. And these are communities that are at much higher risk of epistemic injustice. And I'm sure you all know Fricker, who talks about epistemic injustice, has two types of epistemic injustice. One is testimonial injustice, where an individual is wronged in their capacity as a giver of knowledge. Their ideas are not believed or accepted. And then we have hermeneutical injustice, where someone is wronged in their capacity as a subject of social understanding. They're misunderstood. And so when we think about deaf people who don't have access to language or don't have a fluency in a language, they are at much higher risk of these types of epistemic injustice. And I have some examples that I think will really make this clear to you. And so we can think about DIs being brought in for these scenarios, but historically, their work really has not been recognized as interpreters. They have historically been called language facilitators, which is really an outdated term of saying, oh, they're just helping, and it shows that their work has much lesser status than hearing interpreters. However, research has shown, and Christopher Tester says that, who is a DI, and he studies the work of DIs, and he has argued that sign language variation is the crucial premise for intralingual interpreting. When we think about interpreting training programs that train hearing students to become interpreters, they are often coming in with very little fluency. They are learning sign language that typically aligns with white signers from deaf families who had access to deaf schools, and that doesn't accurately reflect the diversity and variation of signing within the deaf community. And so DIs have the skill to work with this diversity of sign language that exists in the community that hearing interpreters don't have. Now, to dive into this a little bit further and to add this piece around sign language ideologies, there is certainly an ideology that comes out of sign language interpreting agencies as well as scholars who have argued that deaf interpreters have more advanced linguistic and cultural competence than hearing interpreters. And as well, that deaf interpreters are more competent at accommodating diverse deaf people. So this could include deaf newcomers to Canada, deaf people who do not know a standard national sign language, and deaf people with disabilities, for example, deaf-blind people, people with physical disabilities, learning disabilities, and so on. So deaf interpreters have the skill to accommodate their language to all of these different communities. So I'd like now to talk about the research that I have been undertaking. This was a study that looked at the institutionalization of deaf interpreters here in Canada. And so when I say institutionalization, I really just mean in terms of providing formalization in terms of certification and training. And this was a study that started in 2022. I started by sending out a demographic survey to all deaf interpreters listed on the directory of the Canadian Association of Sign Language Interpreters. I invited all DI members to fill out the survey. The survey was asking for demographic information such as their location, citizenship, gender identity, age, race, hearing status, their educational background, their experience with sign language interpreters and interpreting. And so this was the information that I was collecting. And at that time, in the Interpreting Association directory, there were, I believe, 54 deaf interpreter members and nearly 800 hearing interpreters. So the number of DIs was very small. About half of the DIs responded to the survey. And of those who completed the survey, I invited all of them to participate in an interview, which took place on Zoom. I conducted the interviews, and 12 participants of the half that filled out the survey agreed to do the interviews. I also invited all the participants to take part in a focus group that took place last spring looking at perceived foundational competencies and training needs of DIs in Canada. Now, to briefly share this study findings with you, and while I'm going through these statistics, I think it's important again to keep in mind that the rationale for DIs is this diversity of deaf consumers. Again, they're working with many newcomers to Canada, deaf people with disabilities, and so on. Now, in terms of the findings, 80% of participants were born in Canada, and when we think about sign language vitality and access to sign language, we can see who has access when we look at these demographic information. So 80% were born in Canada, just over half were women, 60% were aged 55 or older, so the population of DIs is aging. And 88% identified as white. So this is typically who has access to this fluency, and that is really a concern when we look at the future of this field and who will become DIs in the next generation. In terms of educational and professional background, just to briefly summarize the results, all participants had worked in community settings, 88% had worked in medical and mental health settings. And again, remember, these are high stakes settings, and this is a field that is not offered any formal training. In terms of consumer groups that the DIs had worked with, almost all had worked with deaf newcomers to Canada. All participants had worked with deaf people with disabilities. This next statistic around working with deaf people who are racialized, I think that term may have been misunderstood. Really what I wanted to understand was not the specific racial groups that people had worked with, but that they had worked with individuals who were oppressed because of their race, because of not being white. And 84% seemed quite low to me, so I think that term may have been misunderstood. And then 96% had worked with deaf people who don't know a standard national sign language. So those were the results of the demographic survey, and then I interviewed 12 participants who used both ASL and LSQ from across Canada, and I asked them about their beliefs about DIs and interpreting, their training and professional development experience, their experience working with hearing interpreters, and so on. One theme that really came to light over and over again was when I asked the participants about their formative experiences, how they grew up, what environments they grew up with. It really came to light that most of them had experience in rich signing environments with a diversity of deaf people around them. And so they had that experience of seeing a diversity of sign language being used. And typically this happens in deaf schools. This is where this access to language diversity can take place. And with the increase of mainstreaming, this access to sign language is getting less and less. And you can see this when we look at, for example, the age demographics of DIs decreasing as we looked at younger and younger age groups, which is a big concern. When we think about young deaf people who had access to signing environments, they might have been asked to help, for example, clarify misunderstandings in the classroom, to help fill out forms. They were doing this sort of amateur level DI work from a very young age. In the article that from a colleague that looked at diversity of signing in Canada, we can see that that is decreasing with lack of access to deaf schools. And so this is something that we have to think about when we think about the future of the field of deaf interpreters. This is a quote that came out of one of the interviews. The interviews did take place in sign language, and I recorded the interviews and then translated them into English. I kept the participants anonymous, so I can't show you the video footage, unfortunately, but this is my poor translation of one of their quotes that came out of the interview. This was an older participant who had grown up in a deaf school, and this is what they said. You know, I grew up in school with other students who were deaf like me, all of us seated together in a row. The hearing teacher didn't know ASL. Really, I don't mean to offend anyone, but they were incompetent. But I could understand the teacher. The other deaf students looked at me with furrowed brows. I don't understand what the teacher means. The teacher would point to me. I would turn to the other student's direction and sign to them, giving an example to illustrate the concept being taught. The teacher would say, yes, yes, that's it. So the teacher used me as an ASL translator. And so that's one example of this DI childhood that shows how this child was used as a translator from a very young age. And in this example, this individual was not just copying what the teacher was saying, but really adding more context, more examples, so that the other students would have that context in order to be able to understand clearly. Another question that I asked the participants, this was actually the first question of all the interviews, was what does deaf interpreter mean to you? And again, the answer that all of the participants spoke to was about the power of understanding, that they had this skill to be able to elicit more information from a deaf client, to clarify what a deaf client is saying so that the hearing interpreter could better understand, as well as the other hearing participants. For example, a doctor, this could be in a legal setting, whoever is involved in this appointment was able to much better understand the deaf client when there was access to a DI. And so we can think of hearing interpreters who have this formalized professional training, but so many miscommunications were taking place without having a DI there. And having a DI allowed these proceedings, whether it was a legal setting, a medical setting, to run so much smoother without these sorts of miscommunications. I have some examples to share with you now. Actually, let me just go back for a moment. So these are different scenarios that came from the interviews with various participants that I want to share with you this first that I think will help explicate what the work of a DI looks like, and also the ways in which they are allowing epistemic justice to occur for the deaf clients that they're working with. So this first example, this was one of the first interviews that I conducted, and the participant was called in to work in the context of Children's Aid Society here in Canada. So this is child welfare. They will often remove children from parents' custody if there are concerns of abuse. And so this was the context in which the DI was called in. The child had a bruise on her head, and so child welfare was getting involved. And this is the quote from the DI. The girl's parents had no idea how she hit her head, why she had a bruise on her temple. She went to school that day and came home with a bruise. What happened exactly, I'm not sure. But I saw her signing about driving a toy car and hitting her head. She just went on her merry way, no crying at all. She wasn't sure what had happened to cause the bruise, but thought she hit her head on the toy car. To communicate this concept, she gestured, pushing her head down with her hand. The hearing interpreter saw this and thought the girl was referring to sexual activity. I waved my hand. No, I saw the girl signing about a toy car and hitting her head. I clarified things and everyone was relieved. So that's one example of a very serious miscommunication that can be clarified with having a DI. This is another example that comes from a medical setting, and there was a patient who had not had access to a DI. There was just a hearing interpreter, and then finally a DI was called in. So this is the quote. The client said, "It's time. I'm calling for a DI. Finally, they called for me. I went to the appointment. The doctor was angry and told the client off. The doctor berated the client and said to them, you, all this time, you know you have a disease. You've been reckless all this time and ignored my orders." I interpreted with a neutral expression. The client replied to the doctor, holding up their hands. Up until now, with the hearing interpreter, I couldn't communicate clearly. I finally see a DI for the first time, and it's clear. So again, this very high stakes context where the deaf client had not had access because of not having a DI there. This next example comes from an immigration hearing, I believe, or perhaps a refugee hearing. It was in a legal context. And the judge had booked a DI for LSF, Langue des Signes Française, so not Quebec Sign Language, but French Sign Language. And this DI was fluent in a number of sign languages. But when the DI arrived, they realized they had been booked for the wrong language. And so this was the quote from the interview. I informed the judge, the client can't express herself. You booked me for the wrong language. I call the client's language home sign. She used mostly gesture and home sign. Brush teeth, rub tummy, bed, wash. The client's daughter confirmed, yes, my mother's deaf. She has no language. The judge said, fine, okay, and directed his questions to the daughter. But I tried gesturing, signing, drawing, signing with my hands raised to the level of my head, drawing, and then the client started to express herself. I was shocked. She expressed herself. Her daughter was amazed. They heard the mother's voice. She was wearing a mask. At that time, we were all wearing masks. The judge looked at me. And so for the first time, this individual's intelligibility was able to be recognized. She was labeled as having no language, but the DI was able to understand her. This next example comes from an educational context, and the student, I believe, was a new immigrant to Canada, and the staff at the school thought that this student had no language, and they called in a DI. And so the quote is, I finally met the student. The other people around me asked, what's their sign name? You need to make up a name sign for them. I waved for the student's attention and asked them, do you have a name sign? The student replied and told me their name sign. I was taken aback. The other educators didn't know the student's name sign. They couldn't communicate with the student at all. I told them the student already had a name sign. And so a name sign is a shorthand that we'll use in sign language to call someone their name. And in this situation, the DI could see that there was intelligibility already there. The student had access to language. They had a name sign. They were able to communicate that name sign, but without the DI, nobody else was able to understand that. Now, one of the other themes that came up in the interviews that I would like to just touch on briefly was, and this came up in the focus groups as well, around this desire to be recognized as DIs at the same level as hearing interpreters, because currently DIs tend to be looked down upon in the field and not have as much status as hearing interpreters. And this also connects back to epistemic injustice. Without any formal training or certification programs, hearing interpreters are not able to learn how to effectively work with DIs, and there is a lot that's missed when this training is not provided. And so in order to recognize and really respect the role of DIs, there needs to be more formal recognition and certification. And so currently, I am now moving into phase 2 of this study, which is looking at developing a model for DI training and professional development. It would include opportunities for mentorship and eventually developing a certification pathway. This came out of a federal government grant, and this is going to be going on for the next few years. So in conclusion, I hope that I was able to demonstrate how epistemic injustice is really solved by having a deaf interpreter there, and the importance of deaf interpreters and also the importance of deaf children having access to rich signing environments where they can develop a language and develop that fluency. We can see that going forward, there's going to be even more of a need for DIs. But at the same time, it is a concern about how these DIs are going to be able to develop this skill if they don't have access to the DI childhoods and to these rich signing environments. Being understood is so important for epistemic justice, pardon me, and for flourishing of the deaf community to occur. Okay, so here are my references, and I'll just stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much.